Good evening, everybody. I'm super happy yet again. I'm always happy when I stand at this podium, but I'm really happy tonight to introduce Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee, principals of the award-winning Los Angeles-based firm Johnston Mark Lee and the 2019 Baumer visiting professors here at Ohio State. For the past 2 days, Mark and Sharon have been up in the conference room on the second floor with Ashley Bigham, who's been coordinating the Baumer seminars, and the G3 architecture students, having a grand old time talking about architecture. Look who's here. Now we can start. So it's really been a great couple of days so far, and there's one more to go. Tomorrow's sessions will include a public component. There'll be a discussion on the carpeted space just outside here at 12:30. So I want all of you to think of tonight's lecture as part of a two-day affair, or as part one of a two-day affair, and I really hope you'll join us tomorrow for part two. Now, since Mark and Sharon promised me a somewhat autobiographical lecture last night, I'm not going to perform the normal ritual of CV reading. Suffice it to say that Mark and Sharon are both incredibly talented architects. They're also committed educators, both currently professors of practice at the Harvard GSD, where Mark is also currently serving as the chair of the Department of Architecture. Prior to returning to their alma mater, they taught at UCLA, Princeton, the TU Berlin, ETH and Zurich, the University of Toronto, where they held the Frank Gehry Chair, and Rice, where they held the Cullinan Chair. Now, as you might expect, Mark said something kind of interesting in yesterday's session. I only caught part of it, but so he claimed that there are three kinds of architects. The first are those that start off with a project, that they know what they're going to do, and from the beginning they're just working out how to do it. The second, he said, were architects who didn't start out with a project, and imagine project with a capital P, as I'm saying this. But didn't start out with a project, but worked toward one over the course of their careers. And then finally, there's a third type of architect, which doesn't have a project and never finds one. And what Mark said, that he and Sharon were not the first type, and they were trying to figure out whether they were the second or the third. But I think that kind of frankness is what these sessions are all about. But it got me to thinking, what is their project? And I've known these two for quite a long time. I spent a fair amount of time in the office long ago. Judging by what you see in the world, what you see on the screen, and what's unfolded in the seminars so far, you might think that their project has something to do with process. Throughout their work, you'll find super clear diagrams of the formal processes that determine the shape and organization of their buildings. If you look at the themes around which they've organized their talks with the students, compaction, hinging and stacking, spanning, and framing, you'll also find further evidence that some kind of process, that there's a kind of logical step-by-step way to make the projects, is driving the work. They're there in the Hill House, which is perched on the side of the Pacific Palisades, as the logical fallout of resolving a domestic program with the idiosyncrasies of hillside zoning ordinances. They're there in the Gran Traiano art complex, so clearly put together through stacking and hinging methodologies. So that process is there. Another hint comes in the way that they work to construct views. In the aptly named View House, for example, the whole project is formed around the logic of these view corridors that they organize on the site. A similar logic you can see in almost all of their projects: the Sail House, the Vault House, the House House, and on and on and on. So process and views might be the core of the project, or you might guess that's the core of the Johnston Mark Lee project. I submit that they are not, that their project has to do with something else, and that something else I really think has to do with recovering the power of abstraction in architecture. And you can see it on this screen. Abstraction used to be what modern architecture was all about. Le Corbusier's pure forms in light, remember those? And all that stuff. But after 100 years, those pure forms have become too familiar. They've devolved into cliches. The modern project, in some way, has been exhausted. Rather than constituting abstraction as such, those pure forms in light have devolved into mere signs of abstraction. We see them as signs, not as actual abstraction. In other words, abstract forms actually preclude access to the deeper pleasures of the abstract. Now, postmodern architects began to figure this out 40 or 50 years ago. If sign systems and representation are unavoidable, they reasoned, why not just make architecture out of those sign systems? And at first blush, Mark and Sharon seem to be doing that. They use clearly identifiable formal types, deadpan processes, and very clear site relationships, which I've described a little bit before. But the thing about it is that the types are so identifiable, the processes so clear, the site relationships so obviously sensible, that they ultimately fail to hold our attention. Like in some way, and I don't mean this the wrong way, like they're too dumb to be the point, right? They help bring the project into being, but they don't constitute that capital P project. But what happens is that those kind of processes, those typological figures kind of fall away, and what's left in our attention is a kind of sense of conviction in the shapes themselves. So notice as the work that you'll see tonight goes by, notice on the screen right now, the compositional play of windows. The parade of forms that first appear awkward, but in fact, the more you look at them, resonate with a kind of rightness of their inner logic. Notice the coherence of the shapes as shapes, not as the fallout of problem solving or process execution. So that quality of the things being kind of self-sufficient, those are the effects that 100 years ago we used to get from those pure Corbusian forms in light. Today, we've seen too much of that purity. We understand too much of its inner workings to still be seduced by that vocabulary of modernism. And so I think what Mark and Sharon have done is figured out a way to reactivate those abstract effects by using even more familiar shapes. So these houses and blocks and vaults and square-punched windows, they're able, in a way that the exhausted vocabulary of modern architecture no longer can do, they're able to seduce us again. So Mark and Sharon, in some way, have found a way to unlock the back door into abstraction and the power of the abstract. And so for me, I think that in some way is the project, and that's why I'm so happy to be up here at the podium tonight, and that's why I'd like you to help me make a bunch of noise for Mark and Sharon.
Thank you. Thanks, Thank you. I couldn't believe that I walked into our class right when we were talking about the 3 types of architects. But it reminded me of a quote by Joseph Schumpeter. He was an Austrian economist. He said that he set 3 goals in his life. Number 1 is to be the greatest economist in the world. Number 2, to be the best horseman in Austria. And number 3, to be the greatest lover in Vienna. And then he said he had reached 2 of his goals, but never said which 2. So I think leaving this ambiguity is not bad. Thank you, Todd. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Michael. It's really an honor to be here to take over this chair. And it's been a real pleasure working with the students. Thank you, Ashley, for leading this group. And we feel like we're being diagnosed, with a group of students who know more than we do about ourselves. But it really is an opportunity, for us to be self-reflective. We seldom had that moment, On one hand, we didn't have the time. On the other hand, we have been, I think, evasive about really trying to put ourselves, not just for others, but ourselves where we belong, I had a chance to share my work here 3 times. This is the 3rd time. The first time was 15 years ago. The second time was in 2013. And I arrived the day after Lou Reed died. And I remember I was in the hotel, I was listening to Eyes and walk on the wild side, and thinking, I read a quote of Lou Reed's, was quoted all around in the newspaper. And this is a quote of his before not long before he passed away. He said, "I'm not big time, and I've always been on the outside, and I still am. And maybe that's why I'm still here." So, you know, we sometimes like find solace in other disciplines that maybe they're slightly being on the outside. And as we talked about this autobiography, you know, we thought about the moments when we were educated, the moments when we became architects. I was educated in a time in my undergraduate when postmodernism was on its way out, you know. So, but you also see a lot of postmodern critics who would invite their patriots or their colleagues to come. I remember as a student, you know, being in those reviews, they would talk about their work in a quite obscure language, a quite closed language, you know, but very quickly they became extinct, you know. I remember the time when we were in graduate school, Toyo Ito was talking about two projects that turned the tide for him around the early 90s, was the Herzog de Meuron's Signal Box and the OMA's Big Library in Paris. For him, those are the two projects that came right around the tail end of the deconstructivist show, that the sensibility began to change. So we always found ourselves slightly on the margins of time. When we were in graduate school, it was a time when Koolhaas and Herzog de Meuron, Moneo, Peter Eisenman was still very present. You feel time passing. You feel the ships are passing through each other and times are changing. But it was a very interesting time. I went to teach in Zurich. You know, it was also a changing moment. The discussion was very Berlin-centric. You know, it was after the wall fell and a lot of things happening in Berlin. Hans Kohlhoff was very present. Lampugnani, the reconstruction of the city was very much in the discourse. So I was at that time seen as an American. You know, so somehow a bit of an outsider. And then when we came back and Sharon was a SciArc and I was teaching at UCLA, we were also outsiders in a way. Maybe it's slightly a European sensibility, or maybe we don't share the kind of enthusiasm of this type of digital technologies that characterizes many of the Los Angeles practice at that time. We're not against it. We wanted to take our time. So we're a little bit outside, but we're also very much part of that discourse. So I think this thing about being undefinable or having we discussed with our group, or having a certain veil about us or about our work, it's not to be elusive. I think for us it's having a certain critical distance to understand ourselves better. You know, I think for us, you know, we look at careers like Ellsworth Kelly. You know, when after the war, Ellsworth Kelly moved to France just at the moment when the international art scene was moving to New York. And so after France, when he moved back to New York, he was not American either. You know, his work was too French. You know, he cultivated this hybrid kind of European sensibility with American scale. And at a time when abstract expressionism was very strong. So, you know, but over time, I think this being slightly outside, he, in a way, developed his own, he had the critical room to develop his own project. And he kind of remained singular and developed this type of guileless insistence, you know. So I think in many ways, not directly his work, but it's always a model for us. I forgot to actually advance the slides. So I advance this quickly. I just wanted to start with a series of, we do drawings for buildings. We also do these collages. You know, these collages started off as tools for design, you know, and for us it's also a way to measure up against history. You know, we started off thinking about when we walk on a house on a hill, like which is the best house on the hill, or which is the best house on the beach, which is the best courtyard house. And inevitably, like this type of photographs or representations of these images becomes part of our collages. In a semi-mise-en way, you know, started off with photography with Schulman as a stroller, eventually moved to neo-realist Italian film or new wave film. But for us, these are moments to somehow distill the essence of the project, or the profile of the project.
So yeah, thanks. Just quickly to say thanks to Todd as well. As Todd mentioned, we've known him for a long time, and it just feels like a kind of coming home to be here with you after all of that time in LA. So I think as Mark opened the lecture, in a way, we wanted to start before talking about a few projects in a little bit more depth with not necessarily a kind of autobiographical kind of outlook of the practice, but maybe looking a little bit some of the tools and techniques that we use to look back at our work. It's a kind of evolving process where we're, of course, starting with these early projects, kind of singular object buildings. We're making models. That's a big part of our production in our office. Oftentimes these are, of course, made during the design process, but they're also part of post-production, and I think that's part of how we begin to taxonomize our work, to kind of feedback loop of looking at works as collections, understanding the sort of language that emerges in the work as a kind of alphabet, like the first image that you saw on the slide when we started the lecture, that we're looking at ways in which not only the kind of tectonic of a particular project, but how it starts to evolve. So here in these series where we move from these kind of small singular objects, predominantly houses, to looking at exploring more cultural projects like this pavilion in Chile, where through their scale, conditions of site and such, and program began to multiply. The spaces and forms began to multiply and imply a larger space, a more diverse set of functions, just in very small and incremental ways. But more than anything else, I think that this kind of, the initial outlook of our practice working on these small buildings has led to a kind of idea of form making and scaling up in work that deals with a process that we call approximation. So as the buildings grow, it's more about adding up elements to approximate something bigger, as opposed to perhaps shifting scale, kind of whole cloth. And I think that we're at a moment in our practice where we're really beginning to address bigger buildings and question this once again. So from housing blocks like this project in Switzerland, to a collection of buildings that we did for a master plan in Italy, where these smaller integers begin to approximate more familiar types like the courtyard, or through techniques of stacking and hinging, we began to look at different sort of typological structures that begin to help us think about different scales of space, ways to address context in our work. But somehow this kind of model making that sometimes is during the process or post-production helps the kind of abstraction of that, helps us find a language that can track through the projects. And perhaps more recently, the language of the frame has become emerged in the work from different scales of projects, from commercial to residential projects. And I think you'll see in the projects we present how that, I think, is giving us a chance to address site and the kind of porosity of the way we think about the integration of building and site and more public programs in new ways.
I think as Los Angeles-based architects, the single-family house type is something that is inevitable. So as our office begins to grow, we're doing different scales of projects. The single-family house remains something that is quite consistent, and we have dealt with many different situations or sites. But I think inevitably, somehow we have to wrestle with Benham's four ecologies. Though the book is almost 50 years old. And then in between them, LA has changed a lot. There are other ecologies of fear, different types of mentality as well. But I think in many ways, the physiognomy of the building, still evolved within these four ecologies, although in different ways. So we selected 4 projects over the last 20 years that somehow, I think, represent how some of our responses are typical to these type of ecologies. The first is the Foothill. This is the hill house. Really designed by maximizing the buildable volume and minimizing the contact to the ground. So this type of tension between small footprint, larger space, were also brought to the openings and the windows. So small windows for the private spaces that are inset at certain pochette depth versus the large windows facing the view and then pushed to the edge of the volume. So it's a very site-specific lot, and also responds to some of the issues of hillside building, where the overdensity in construction on the hillside, lots that were used to be single lots that were subdivided into 2 lots, and then you build on these type of substandard lots is typical of this situation that we face in the Hill House, which is about like 100 yards from the Eames House, and not far from the ocean. The structure, of course, when we built this house, had to deal with a lot more earthquakes. So it's a steel and concrete house, but we hid all the steel because it will look like a huge steroid steel house next to the Eames house. But you sense that it's the steel house from the cantilever and the lack of intermediary support within the house. We looked a lot at like Marcel Breuer's hotel at Flan, for example, how the house is cantilever, but then there's a diagonal that ties back to the lot. Our diagonal is perpendicular to the hill, so that the floor that you're seeing here is actually act in tension to pull it back. The Tom Main really hated that we put this column, in this corner. This is the column for us where the water gets captured in the roof and drained. But architecturally, for us, it's important to have that delineation of the volume. It's not the dematerialization of the corner itself, but actively, it's an opening for us. So the indoor-outdoor space is not like the mid-century type of houses where the floor and the ceiling float past beyond the glass, but it's a direct reversal from an interior internalized space to an outdoor gazebo just by opening these 6 8-foot wide windows. So the openness of the house, even the stairs suspended. I don't know why this image is here. Yeah, I guess it's some way it's a face too. The second house is really dealing with the plains, the plains. But although this is not in LA, it's in Argentina. It's built in a suburban development. We know that in the future, when we started the project, there's no houses around. We know in the future, 2 of the 4 sites will be inhabited by future houses. So we preemptively designed the house so that the windows and the apertures will not face those houses, so they look between them. Like when you're in a subway, you look between the faces up to have this kind of spatial expansion. So it's a very simple spiral circulation. You walk up, but as you walk around the house, every turn you have, there will be a window. And then it looks out, it kind of frames the views quite differently. So you don't see the entire view until you walk up to the roof, and then you see this panoramic view of the Pampas again. It's a very simple geometry. The base geometry is a half ellipse, a half rectangle. We cut the volume in 4 corners, 4 alternating corners. 2 of them are straight cuts on a singly curved surface, and 2 of them are fragments of a sphere. This is the first project we did outside of the US, so it's a construction culture particularly we're not familiar with. So we figured that if they could build a formwork for a dome, they could easily build a formwork for a fragment of a dome. So we try to economize the means to create the maximum effect of dynamism, which is addressing an object in a corner. Mentioned to our class that is not the quality of Swiss concrete, but pretty close to German concrete, which is a triumph for us to do this in Argentina. But here you see the relationship of the opening in relationship to the cuts is always contiguous to one of these cuts. This is the entry, and then eventually you will walk back out and spiral, take the stair up to this roof garden. I think in contrast to the exterior, the interiors are quite light, quite open. A series of windows where this one there's push-in for poché that brings shade to it, but also lets the profile be continuous outside the window. Here you see the checkerboard relationship of the window in relationship to the cut. I mentioned to our group that this is one of the 2 projects we ever did that we use a butt joint glass. For us, it's the analogy is like blowing a soap bubble into a container. So the space is not always a residual of the container, but sometimes it declares its own presence. So the cuts are always used for light. Sometimes it's artificial light. In this case, it's a reflector, or sometimes it's used as a reflector of natural light, like on the 2nd floor. Always as a secondary lighting source. And then you walk up the corridor, and then you walk up, and then you walk up to the roof, and then you see this view. So the best compliment we had of this house when it was finished was from a blogger who said this looks like the love child of Mario Botha and a septic tank. But for us, it's a compliment, I think. The Botha part. The third ecology is the beachfront. So this is a house built on a beach. It's in Oxnard. But like many of the beachfronts in LA, it's quite similar. The depth of the beach is very different, but all the lots are very long and narrow. So you have the situation where they're packed like sardines. People put their living room, master bedroom in front, great. The rest of the house is kind of dark and dank. You always have to walk between houses to enter into your house. So the first thing we wanted to do is to open up the center of the house, to create some spatial decompression when you walk between two houses and walk in. And then the second thing we wanted to do is bring as much view and light through the house. So I think the diagram for us is that we gave every room a vault, and they're always open at the end. So each vault has an axial dimension, but as a collective, there's only a single directionality. It doesn't have a single axis. So this is the kind of diagram of the project. We organized the rooms in quite a matter-of-fact way, and then we gave everyone a kind of a barrel vault. It's almost like a variation of a shotgun type. Work a lot with models. We just want to point out, like the vaults almost never overlap. So you get these situations of disjunction where a big vault in the double height living room will intersect with will be tangential to the master bedroom, or you have this kind of strange Gothic moment here. Some asked us about why we rotated the clear story light. Is it trying to do an abstract cheese or a SpongeBob SquarePants? And I was explaining that we don't start off with a heuristic model. We start off with an archetype, but then as we developed the project, when we tested the clear story light, for secondary sources of light, because although we have an empty lot next to us, we know there will be a house that will be built, and which is being built now. But to have a right side up vault basically will result in a groin vault, like a basilica. So we thought by turning it upside down, it actually have the longest side cutting through the vault, so cutting through the main vault, so it brings more light in. So this is shot after it was finished. So the house, there's no house on the side, but we know eventually there will be one. But you begin to see the type of where the upside down vaults, whether it's clear story lights or the aperture for the courtyard, or another skylight that comes from the roof deck down to the balcony. It's much more like an Irving Gill or low slide building that works well with the Spanish colonial houses, but it's much more compact, on the street side. But we even use the vault to cut open the edge to widen the pathway as you walk towards the house, as opposed to a more porous side facing the beach. So you walk to the center of the house, you take a few steps up, and you walk to the courtyard. On one side, it faces the library and the den, and then on the opposite side, you face the dining room, kitchen, and eventually the living room. Upper right is the master bedroom. So planning-wise, we placed the master bedroom up there, so it has to, on the other side, look through the double height space. On this side, it faces the courtyard, so it has light and air on both sides. This is a Viola Frey sculpture, so it's not a human scale. But this ended up in the double height space. So planning-wise, we allowed this double height space so that the master bedroom could be set back. Looking back at the master bedroom, these are two fish sculptures from Frank Gehry's Rebecca restaurant that was demolished, and some of the pieces were salvaged. So we're really happy our client bought this. So we brought the fish back to next to the ocean. But here you see I think the upside down clear story light and how it cuts through the main vault. So it opens up the space for the master bedroom as well as bring secondary light into the space. So this shot is taken with the photographer's back against the two bedrooms against the street. So you're almost at the end of the house, but you can see through the courtyard, through the main space, and be directly connected to the water and the sand. And also some skylights. And then the last ecology is, the automobile. We always thought of this house, this project, this diagram as a house where there are 3 garages that faces outside and then 3 volumes that faces inward, so a much more introverted house. Although this is not a house, this is a pavilion that we designed for the Shanghai Biennale. We were told that they wanted it to be a permanent building, but they didn't tell us what they wanted the building to be. They said it could be an office, could be a restaurant. It ended up being the Shanghai Center of Photography. If we would have known, we wouldn't have any curved walls because they couldn't put on huge German photographs now. But it's a very straightforward diagram. It evolved from a project that we did before with 2 half ellipse shapes, And it became 6. We call it this house with 6 views. So there are 3 that are extroverted, that are framing different views of the site. And then, fortunately, one of the sites is the new Pompidou, the Chipperfield finish across the street. And then 3 of them are facing inwards to this courtyard. And the entry is always at the crevice between one of the internally facing volume and one of the externally facing volume. So there are 3 entries. It's just simply by extending the edge of one volume to another to create a secondary skylight into the space. So when you're in one of these externally or internally oriented volumes, you always have a directionality, but also at the opposite side have a second source of light coming down. This thing was designed and constructed in 6 months. I was there a day before the opening. There are 40 people working on the site. I said, there's no way that this will be finished. It would take another month. But when I went the next day, it was finished. They said, welcome to China's speed. I mean, there's some moments where the building appears to be quite large. It depends on the angle, the way we sited it. And then some moments it's quite attenuated. So this would be one of the typical rooms that you look out and then there's a secondary source of light coming in. And this is after it was transformed into this center of photography. These are the moments when it's a little bit more smaller, and then versus a much larger presence. Right.
Great. So to, I guess perhaps further frame some of the thinking for the projects, looking again a bit at the lineage of the work from these earliest projects where it's a very sort of elemental way in which we're using building mass to stack or to approximate something bigger through the introduction of a courtyard, or the way in which we, in specific response to historical context, began to look at maybe more kind of primitive forms that began to multiply and respond to particular programs. This is a building for art on a private residence. To then looking at sort of maybe ways that we begin to approximate much kind of bigger forms through repetitive actions like stacking or tiling, ways in which we look at thinking about creating a collection of buildings through a kind of self-similar formal language that has both very definitive, highly performative spaces like these theaters, but then has a kind of slack space around it that's the result between the space of the skin and this inner envelope that becomes a productive space for us, both climatically in terms of building performance, but also in terms of public space. And then I think, again, as I talked about in the model series, the way we're also beginning to explore how the frame can become a device for us to think about even more porous and fluid boundaries and flexible programs that can accommodate more diverse kind of institutional programs and then be in response to specific climates. Also, I think the question of the interior is something that preoccupies us a lot. We continue to work on interior projects, standalone interior projects, as much as new buildings. And in particular, the question of the aperture, Todd talked about it a little bit, is something that preoccupies us. Of course, it's a device to bring light and have views and air and all those things that we know. But I think in our work, it's also become a device by which we begin to negotiate the inner envelopes of buildings and the outer envelopes of buildings. We talked in the workshop a bit about how we use poché space. I mean, of course, we're dealing with thick and thin building envelopes, but it also, that sort of distance that we project between the interior and the exterior does a lot of work for us to do with how we think about how the building feels, how it regulates itself in terms of climate, how it marks time, all of those things that bring a kind of physicality to something that I think defines our work.
So in this second half of our talk, we'd like to focus on some of the institutional projects that we've worked on. Some of them, they're in different stages of development. So a couple of them have just been finished, some of them are being developed, and some of them we just started. But I think dealing with the institutional scale project beyond the size being bigger than houses, also it has more kind of urban and social implications that pertains to a larger scale. So I think this relationship between the house and the city, or the building and the city, we have always had this interest. You know, this is like some of the studies we've done a while ago about this notion of the decentralized museum. You know, whether it's museum within a park or sculpture or art in a park, which is the upper row. We're looking at models like Aaron Hirlich, Homburg Foundation, or the single pavilion like the Serpentine in Hyde Park, or Storm King or Jinhua Art Park, versus situations where the decentralized museum are scattered within an urban setting or town or city, like Marfa. Donald Just Marfa was a small town of 2,000 inhabitants, or Dia Foundation in the 80s in Soho, when the Di Maria installations together with printed matter are scattered throughout Soho, but forms a constellation to the Menil campus, or even more ephemeral situations like the Berlin Art Biennial. So the projects we'll show has to do with, there's a project in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, that the artist Fiesta Gates had redeveloped some of these projects that were left over. A lot of them were bought by University of Chicago, anticipating that the Olympics would come to Chicago. When it didn't happen, they were left with all these undeveloped land and didn't know what to do. And Fiesta, being a professor of the school, began to rehabilitate some of these buildings and turn them into whether housing program or art programs and such. Another project is the UCLA Graduate Art Studio. Is located in Culver City in Los Angeles. In the architectural world, Culver City is, we're known for a lot of works by Eric Owen Moss. Most of his work were there that spans decades. And also it's a place that traditionally was built by these warehouses, or these light industrial warehouses, although in the last 20 years, a lot of them have been gentrified into creative or post-production offices. So like dealing with these two type of building fabric, you know, that we have to deal with at UCLA. Or a project that was a short study for the expansion of MoCA in Los Angeles, and also dealt with the Grand Avenue, the cultural corridor downtown. When MoCA was built, it was the only building there. It was really a ship on a dry dock with nothing around. But I think with the completion of the Broad by Dilys Scofidio Renfro, was really this whole cultural corridor is finished together with, or there's no more like missing tooth on the side, together with Gary's Disney, Copimo Blouse School, or Monneo's Cathedral, or Colburn, I forgot.
Colburn is a music school. Actually, and Frank's doing an addition to that now.
Yes, it's, I'm just blanking out. It's Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer, sorry. And then a project in Chicago for MCA, and understanding how the MCA, Museum of Contemporary Art, worked together with other art institutions in the city, and then the public spaces related to that. And then to the Menil, which has a campus of institutional scale projects, whether it be a chapel or Flavin's last installation, or the adjacency to St. Thomas University of Johnson's with his chapel that was built, one of his last projects, to the pre-war houses that was preserved by the Menil family, the coexistence of these two fabric. And then a project that we just started is the Philadelphia Contemporary. As a non-collecting museum, it's like a Kunsthalle that is at the intersection of the Penn and Drexel campus. So it's a new tech park, but right adjacent to Venturi and Scott Brown's Venturi and Rauch's Scientific Institute, which is part of Drexel now, other institutions within the campus, as well as the Mantua neighborhood. It's a predominantly African-American neighborhood that's right at the threshold of it. So the first project is the Green Line Art Center. This is the project that we collaborated with Fiesta Gates. It's in Southside Chicago. It's right where the elevated Green Line train kind of cuts through the site. There's some existing buildings, you know, to the right-hand side of this image, but they own basically the entire strip. So the first two buildings on the right has already been renovated by Fiesta, with a bookstore, with a cafe, with a public program for the arts. And so the red is the building that we're working on to contain two performance centers. So there's the importance of the historical facade that we wanted to keep, and also another wall that we're keeping, and then we basically got the interior to build a new building. So So we looked at both the type of houses around there with the pitch roof, but also the industrial roof, this kind of continuous sawtooth serrated roof. Working with the program, we injected 2 pieces that are not called for in the program, which are like winter gardens that are non-programmatic spaces. So for us, these are third spaces that are contingent or adjacent to some of these fixed programs, but these fixed programs could spill out to these winter gardens. So I think this type of serrated roof will also expand it to the backyard of the existing building, so it forms a shed, for their book fairs or their farmers market, and it's right directly adjacent to the Green Line. We kept one of the walls, so we built a double wall to create that type of sound barrier. So the 2 shorter triangles are these winter garden programs that we injected into the site. So on the left you see the theater. The next one is one of the first winter garden. The next is the black box theater, and the next one is the winter garden again. So the doors could open and the whole space could be connected as one space. So this is the view where we kept part of the facade. You look through the glass to the cinema, with the cinema looking through one of the winter gardens, through the black box theater to another theater, to another winter garden. So this is one of these kind of swing spaces that are neither this program nor that program. This is the other one that's more connected to the street. Now this, when we're envisioning the program and how the roof begins to house the programs that are outdoors or indoors or can spill out into the street. And we also think of the roof as a device that we could begin to colonize the rest of the site. However, the site is being developed. So we can imagine that being outdoor spaces or continuing this type of shed typology. It could be built in to house other programs. But this is how we're thinking of establishing a rhythm that could be continuous throughout the site.
So this is the Philadelphia Contemporary Project. It's quite a new project, but it is, as Mark mentioned, it sits in a kind of confluence of 3 different significant neighborhoods, from university campuses to a kind of historically very challenged neighborhood that is projects like the Philadelphia Contemporary are trying to kind of embed themselves in and build back up through a kind of close collaboration on program and such. So conceptually, as this diagram reflects, we're trying to think of this building really like a scaffold or a kind of framework that's as porous as possible to support both kind of visual transparency but literal kind of fluidity in the way that programs can move inside and out. And I think one of the things that defines the project today is the way that this, not only the kind of framework of the structure of the building, but these sort of parasitic table structures, that, as we call them. And part of our initial conception for the project was to think about how to start the life of a building really out before the building is built. And so we proposed to work with artists and neighborhood groups to build these pavilions that could be used to stage meetings with them, different kinds of collaborative experiences. One of them is a recording studio, another is a camera obscura. So ways in which local artists and educators and kids could participate in the making of the building while these structures are out in the neighborhood as the building is being built, and that eventually they would come back to the building and sort of, so as a tool to embed the structure and even the process into the space of Mantua. So it's in a way it has exhibition space, education space, food, all of the things that you might expect in a contemporary building. But I think what we're striving to embed in the project is a kind of, first of all, a kind of very meaningful and rich, I mean, almost awkward way that programs come together, so that like what happens in a city, there's kind of unexpected encounters. It's a very raw building, and it really feels almost more like a fragment of the city than an interior museum architecture. And this next project is the UCLA Graduate Art Studios campus. And UCLA, this is not in Westwood where the main campus is, but in Culver City in the Hayden Tract. Mark talked a little bit about it and the sort of legacy of Moss in this neighborhood. UCLA's been here since the mid-'80s, and it's, I think, been part of the sort of renegade attitude of the MFA program, which is one of the top in the country, So being separated and isolated has been a really important part of their identity. And so it's defined by a large wallpaper factory, which is the big warehouse building here. And then over the years, some of these buildings sort of like barnacles agglomerated around the building. Some are provisional sheds, and some were kind of serious buildings that had sort of outlived their life. So here's a couple of views of those structures and how they sit in this very ad hoc way on this corner of Warner and Hayden and Culver City. So we deployed kind of very straightforward operations, first to remove all these unusable buildings, and then given this is an old warehouse from, I just think it's the 30s, everything was raised up 3 feet, so as a loading dock. So the second diagram just illustrates how we can create a continuous ground through meeting the floor level of the warehouse. We inscribe a new facade that embraces the entire 55,000 square foot perimeter of the site, and then we take the sort of typology of the stick bow truss roof and reimagine it as a new roof structure, a kind of solar umbrella that covers the entire site. So here's the model. The warehouse of the existing building is here in the back, and you can get a sense of the scale of the new trusses. These are glulam beams that somehow evolve the technology of the old-fashioned bow truss. And then the building is the new facade that wraps like in the L-shaped form is tilt-up concrete construction. So it had benefits in terms of building performance, the thermal mass of the structure, and it met some of our environmental criteria. So without the roof, the building is organized as a neighborhood of studios in the warehouse, with cul-de-sacs and streets. So it has kind of informality about it, which was a really important part of our discourse with the students and faculty. And the new programs are made up in a kind of serial structure of enclosed labs, which are conditioned spaces, and then covered but unconditioned yards that serve also as loading docks, another enclosed yard, sculpture yard, a new volume that has an artist in residence studio, a gallery, and some classrooms, and then finally the entry courtyard on the north end of the building. So here in the sculpture yard gives you a sense of, I think one of the things we introduced in the building is a very different new scale. These are large volumes of space. They have a very particular quality of light, and they are adjacent to highly functional lab spaces. So there's a kind of casualness in the way that materials can move between these different production yards, and results in a kind of real efficiency in how the building is used by the students. Looking the other way, looking east, that same yard becomes continuous with some of those other production spaces, so it becomes from about a 3,000 square foot space. It can easily function as a contiguous 9,000 square feet of functional area. And then the third space, which is the garden and the entry area, which is kind of an informal space for the students to hang out, not unlike your courtyard. So, in building up, kind of looking at the longer span of history from the more recent Moss legacy to the kind of earlier history of the more generic warehouse, we thought a lot about the legacy in Southern California of Louis Baltz, the artist and photographer that captured the sort of enigmatic quality of these anonymous warehouse buildings, subtly making kind of marking this as an institution through the scale of the openings, the kind of radical transparency into the building, the kind of slight visibility of the roof truss, or the introduction of a garden, which is a relatively unfamiliar kind of landscape in this particular part of the city. So these are acacia trees. So a lot of thought went into kind of how they can grow and become robust, but still maintain this sort of surreal in-between scale to this courtyard. The yards. The building main kind of new facade is tilt-up concrete construction, which was we explored that both. I mean, primarily because its efficiency. The erection time of these walls, once they were cast, they were cured on the ground for 7 days, and the whole perimeter was erected in about 5 days, so it was a really fast process. And I think what it was a tight budget project, so thinking of how every kind of piece of the building we could inscribe kind of attributes of materiality or simply a profile as a kind of detail feature. So this scalloping of the concrete gives us a thickness that we wanted, is to alleviate waterproofing and extra layers in the wall assembly, but it also becomes a detail in the way that it intersects or kind of interacts with light and shadow. So these images, Iwan just took these images, so they're sort of pretty new to us, but I think capture nicely how the building sits in this kind of raw industrial landscape of Southern California. It's both kind of anonymous, but in its scale signals something institutional. It's really the only institutional building in this neighborhood. The students haven't really fully moved in yet, but I think what is important about the project, we know that it's a very raw building. It's a place for making, very much like your building here. And so kind of main organizing structure of the project is the roof. And we, even in these images where you're seeing equipment being moved in, that this kind of strength and order of the building is not by what's happening at the ground and plan, but more about how the kind of atmosphere is defined by the roof structure. The stair leads up to the artist in residence studio, so it really does have a kind of urban quality to it in the way that students move through. Crits are happening. There's a lot of different kinds of events that happen in the building as a kind of 24-hour center for production. In the warehouse, we took everything out of that but the artist studios, and to kind of amplify that sense of the building being raw and unfinished, we create a datum for the drywall and let the kind of framing of those, the rest of the studios remain. This is kind of day 2, so the students have really taken over the space. And here's the artist studio, so there's no ceilings over any of the studios, so it really feels like you're part of a collective space, which is very much the spirit of the UCLA program. A new gallery, which is a program that didn't exist before, that sits on the lower level but borrows light through an open structure from the lofted truss and skylights above.
But I think in many ways the context of that building was Eric Moss, at least from an architectural standpoint. And I think for us the buildings of Moss that interest us the most are the ones that maybe more in the early work. There's a strong contrast and dialectic relationship with the existing fabric there. So for us, it's we think our building is not somehow returning to a past that never was, but I think it's to reassert a certain roughness that exacerbate that difference that was embodied in the architecture scale of Moss's building, but to a larger, maybe neighborhood extent, because as some of these buildings are turned into the ones not by Moss that were turned into these gentrified offices. We thought that would be the kind of death knell. This kind of sharp contrast is gone. We want to show this project very quickly. This is a study that was commissioned by MoCA to think of how we could, in two phases, one, renovate the building to improve the circulation, and the other to add new galleries to it. So this is a shot taken 1986. Right after it was finished. So this was the moment when it was like nothing around. It was really the ship in dry dock, this Indian sandstone, you see the crushed glass, curved wall, the piano curve wall that Isesaki called the Menil Curve, but a series of Euclidean geometries, the barrel vault, the cube, the pyramid skylights and such. Oh, by the way, this was like finished 1 year before Piano's Menil. And then also maybe 10 years before the Clyhus building that was shown. So we somehow the last few years we've been dealing with a lot of postmodern buildings of that vintage. This is what it is today. So a lot of the purity of the forms are gone. Over time, there was another glass canopy that was added to cover the sunken courtyard. Nancy Holt pieces is there. MoCA lost control over the surrounding area, so beneath the steps on the right-hand side is really controlled by the California Plaza, the hotel, the cafes out there. So somehow it lost that type of aura that it had when it was first built. So we look back, this is a drawing by Isesaki, has this kind of Giorgio de Chirico quality of the long shadows, the purity of the volume, and we thought, what was before, this is now, So this is what it is. All these billboards and things that have been cluttered, they're more direct problems in terms of circulation and wayfinding that we try to solve. So we just had very simple solutions. Like these are things that we propose to take out. These are things that we propose to add on or modify. So fundamentally, it's building a wall, building the same wall that defines the courtyard as the MoCA courtyard. So it's not part of the hotel court outdoor space anymore. So when you walk in, you know you have arrived in MoCA. Also, we switched the bookstore and the cafe, so we don't want to have. We walk past the food court before you see art. So you actually walk past the bookstore and then bring the cafe upstairs, and remove the ticket box as well. So this is the addition of the study of the galleries that are on top of the existing galleries. It's a very difficult project. It took us a long time to figure out the right language to deal with the barrel vault, the pyramids of Isozaki. We found for us that Rosetta Stone was another small project that Isozaki did in Venice for the collector or the dancer Teresa Bjornson, a house where it's a box that was cut in 4 sides. The 4 sides so when you look at it directly, it looks like a pitch roof house, but it's actually 2 cuts that brought natural light into the gallery spaces. So we basically use that as a point of departure and then begins to multiply it. So those become the spaces, almost like a warehouse, those become the spaces where one enters from below before entering into a gallery with a more standard series of skylights. I think our goal was also to make it into a unified whole. So it's not very clear which were the new addition, which were the old addition. The entire block being continued with this Indian sandstone. So this also creates a stronger volume and reinforces the void that is in the middle. So with the new context of the buildings, the larger scale buildings around it, somehow has the same weight and volume to deal with them. And so this is directly across the street from the Broad Museum. And this is the project that we deal with. We designed an interior master plan for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. It was designed by Joseph Paul Clyhus, completed in 1996. We did an interior master plan. The first phase of the interior master plan was realized. We also designed a concept study for an expansion. 1996, Clyhus, some of you might know, had Berlin-based architect, for a long time had a strong relationship with Cooper Union, taught there with Rossi, very close to Haydock. When he directed the IBA to reconceptualize Kreuzberg in West Berlin, there are a few of the built Haydock projects that are there. Neo-rationalists maybe have a very different way of thinking about the city than at least thinking about Berlin than Matthias Ungers, who left Cornell and went back. But it was a much more his vision of Berlin was much more about the repairing of the old city, reinforcing the 19th century Blockraum. So how did it fare out in Chicago? So Chicago, he created a variation of the Alter Museum of Berlin, built on a socle. You walk up the stairs, very neoclassical building, really contained by the grid. Quite unliked, the view to the connection to the park, to the lake is lost, and also very trapped by the grid. So I think having worked with the building, we kind of know some of the history of how the building at one point had to be value engineered, but was shrunk instead of chopped off because the grid was so dominant. So some of the scale of the galleries were compromised. 23 feet works well as a painting gallery, but doesn't work well with sculpture. So there are a lot of these moments. That also this disjunction between the interior, the symmetry of the exterior, and the asymmetry of the interior. So we were thinking how this building could be modified and could be connected to the ground, could be more porous in the ground, but also improve the interior circulation. That was the first step. So this is just a very quick series of studies that we did in terms of circulation. It's always this is before, this after. There's before, there's after. It's always somehow rebalancing, like sometimes mimicking or redesigning a stair, that this kind of football ship-shaped stair that Clyhus did, doing an interpretation of that, almost in an acupuncture way, open up zones that are clogged to free up the program. It entailed adding floors, so reinforcing maybe the differences between the spatial hierarchies. opening up what was the ground floor as educational space as a public space and adding another floor that faces the atrium. So this, what was closed before, became a barrel vaulted cellar, you know, so like almost like a dungeon. For us, we call this a street. We work with Christophily on the wall paintings as well as the speculation of the color scheme. So this, for example, is our interpretation of the Clyhue stair. That brings you up, that this was a dead end, and we found a way to bring natural light in, but to bring people up to the upper floor in this new collaborative space with Pedro and Duana installation on the ceiling, with Christophyli's mural. But the larger master plan also entailed by opening the base up, actually entails defining it and closing it. You know, by closing it, then we can actually have more puncture. So to really not shy away from the base, but to acknowledge the base. Same thing with the backside facing the lake. So all the walls that somehow created a kind of meandering circulation that make it very difficult, we made it much more open. But at the same time, defining the frame of the base. So this was at the end when all the bases were opened up that we envisioned. This was on the lake side, how we can basically add a new addition to it. So we basically try to take the same grid module, you know, but built it, constructed out of something much lighter, aluminum, you know, with an atrium facing the lake. So this was a schematic study that we did for the addition to that. And also begin to study how the volume relates to the park immediately adjacent to it, as well as how the other institutions relate to the park. So this is what it is now, and this is what we thought it could be. Okay.
So this is the last project we're going to present. This is the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston. And most of you are probably familiar with this building, Renzo's building, that was finished in the late 80s, the Menil Collection building that was commissioned by Dominique de Menil. There was a master plan that was developed prior to us being awarded the project, and this was the existing condition of the site at that time. So this is the Menil Collection, the Twombly Gallery, Rothko Chapel, Byzantine, the Flavin Building, and this entire area that the Menil control is about 30 acres. So the campus is defined by the sort of mothership of the Menil Collection building, and then these satellite buildings that all have a kind of distinct and different art-going experience. But what defines them, I think, both in the neighborhood and really internationally as an art experience, is the galleries that are defined by light from above, all in very different kinds of atmospheres and light art on view. But I think that's what's the Menil has become known for. Equally important to the institutional buildings is the gardens between them that are both kind of chill out park space, but also defined by significant works of art. There's a lot of Michael Heiser's work that just becomes part of the everyday fabric of this neighborhood. And then finally the layer of these residential bungalows with the Menils bought up over time and transform them for different kinds of program, for domestic use and also institutional program for their staff, and unify them all by painting them the same color gray. And in these gardens that define all of this campus are these great oak trees that bring a kind of atmosphere and light to the campus. So the Drawing Institute is about 30,000 square feet. It's somewhere between a house and a museum. And so we thought a lot about this relationship between the Menil Collection building and the Philip Johnson House, which was one of Philip's first houses by a client that commissioned him, and it was finished in the early 50s. And Jean and Dominique had spent a lot of time in Caracas and Venezuela, so there was a similarity between those two kind of atmospheres. And so the presence of the courtyard, this tropical garden that you see in the house and the image on the right, the dark floors, the kind of intimacy of the house was really an important part of the dialogue that Renzo and Dominique had. And this is one of the courtyard galleries in the Menil Collection building. So the beginning of Chipperfield's master plan, the kind of as-built condition, and then his proposal to remove the large apartment building and replace it with a kind of denser development along Richmond Avenue and open up a new park, and plan to, for the new Drawing Institute, a couple of other possible single artist galleries, and a new energy house, which we ended up doing these two buildings. So conceptually for us, the Drawing Institute, it's a relatively unprecedented museum type, in that there are very few buildings around the world that are dedicated to works on paper that have very specific environmental controls. So we thought about the building with a kind of large roof that's just stretched out over the landscape, a thin structure that shelters the works, but also creates a more intimate space as a prelude to entry into the building. So just as a series of very simple diagrams, we thought a lot about the existing landscape fabric of trees that define the campus. We built rooms around those trees as garden courtyards, and then the building nests between those courtyards as almost like a kind of infill approach. And unlike all the other buildings, for the most part, on the Menil institutional buildings, we sit quite close to the residential bungalows. So there's a different scale, not only because of the building function, but given its proximity to those structures, it was important. So inside, underneath the roof, we thought of the building as a collection of small rooms that house the exhibition spaces. It's a scholar study center and also a conservation laboratory and drawing archive. And all of that is nested under this thin steel plate roof. We think about the courtyards having kind of an everyday quality, but also spaces that can be programmed for performance, as well as some of the more public spaces. We call this space the living room. It's the main entry that could be not only a public space, but a space for different kinds of art exhibition or meetings and performance that don't have the same kind of restrictive requirements that the drawings do. And the courtyard's also, part of everyday life of the Menil campus, the neighborhood. People walk their dogs. It's a very informal space. So organizationally, it's a kind of low-lying roof structure that connects the east and west courtyards and the scholar courtyard to the north. And then a little bit like a kind of diptych, the back building, which houses the drawing study center and the archive, sits almost as a very casual background building in relationship to the courtyards and gallery space. So here is before we started the project, and this is largely how it looks today, where the Drawing Institute is nested here within this kind of most residential part of the campus, the new energy house, and a new garden that we formed in between these two buildings. We worked with Michael van Valkenburg, who I believe did the garden for your building as well. I think you guys will see a lot of similarities between the sensibility in the garden. So from the south, the building feels quite mute. It's really more of a porch to this large-scale new southern garden that MVVA is developing. As you swing around to the north, you have a sense of what happens underneath these kind of extended walls that form the courtyards. They're planted with Mexican oak trees, and so you can literally see in this image how not only were they kind of beautiful spaces to rest, but they're also doing a lot of work in terms of modulating light and shadow, which was an important part of the program that we had to address. So they're active spaces. The way that the roof structure and the trees creates a kind of pattern of light and shadow is a really key part of how our environmental controls that modulate the 10,000-foot candles that are outside into the 5-foot candles of the galleries. The living room is that meeting space that consolidates a lot of the circulation in the building. It's a space of arrival. It's the space of meeting, a space of events. There's usually tables here, so there's books and sort of a lot of different things happening in the living room. To the south of the living room is the drawing gallery. And then as you look back to the west, you're looking back out at the energy house, another view in the annex looking back to Twombly. I think for us, given the kind of interior nature of the exhibition spaces, all the spaces where art are, it was really key that you always had generous views back out to the garden. You were as anchored to the outside landscape. And that different than most museums, and certainly the Menil, where light is coming in from above, at the Drawing Institute, all the spaces except for one of the rooms light comes in from the side, much more like a kind of domestic setting. And the dormers of the living room are largely there to modulate the light. We rarely need to use artificial light in that space. The galleries are calibrated specific for drawings, so a 12-foot 6 high ceiling, which accommodates the kind of more general and average size of works on paper in that room. To the north of the living room is the cloister, the scholar courtyard, which is a visible garden, not really an occupiable one. It has a very different scale of plantings that modulates light. It's a space for circulation, but also a meeting space for scholars. It also has a lot of transparency back out into the Menil campus. So it almost kind of feels like a world unto its own outside of the space of the public parts of the building, although it's visible from those areas. The heart of the building is really the drawing room. It's the one place where you can interact with works on paper in daylight from above. It's a seminar space. It's a space to study as a singular scholar or in classrooms, so it has that kind of generosity of scale. It sits immediately adjacent to the conservation lab, so scholars and conservators are working between these two spaces. And then as you move back out on the east side of the building, which is largely symmetrical with the west courtyard, it's a very different, more almost, it's much more flowered now, but it's a more almost domestic scale garden to complement the sort of arid garden on the west side. These porches, you navigate around them. You can pass right through the southern porch and never enter the building. But they're modulating light. They're sheltering some apertures that allow for views into the building. Each building at the Menil is marked by a kind of donor piece. This is a work by Ellsworth Kelly that is called the Menil Curve, which is part of an acknowledgement of the donors who supported the building. And this is the last image that looks at the building in a kind of twilight condition that I think captures the qualities that we're looking at in terms of the way we're studying the relationship of building and landscape as a kind of in-between or threshold space. So interior and exterior, this kind of atmosphere of in-between that's captured in the twilight is something that we're really looking at a lot more now in our larger scale institutional buildings. And that's the last slide. Thank you.